Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Rasputin. In the early 1900s, Grigory Rasputin was the mystical advisor to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. During those years, no other political figure was so mysterious or controversial. Even these days, there are rumors that he rose from the dead and that he was impossible to kill. Some people even believe that he truly had some kind of magical powers. They called him the Mad Monk, and his rise from peasant to the royal court of Russia is still a story for the ages. But how did he do it? Rasputin was born in 1869 in a tiny village in Siberia. He drank a lot and he was a known womanizer. He also made his money through petty thievery. As he grew into a young man, his desire for more in life led him to abandon his family, and he set off in search of spiritual wisdom. He studied with monks, but not just any monks. He joined an offshoot of the Russian Orthodox religious group who believed that the only way to reach God was through sinful activity. This resulted in Rasputin becoming even more of a deviant, allegedly sleeping with hundreds of women, even though people claimed he smelled like a goat. Then came Alexandra Fedorovna, a firm believer in the occult and the wife of Tsar Nicholas. When her only son Alexei began to suffer from hemophilia, she went in search of a healer, and that was when she found Rasputin. However, he was technically introduced to Nicholas prior to that, in early November of 1905, but when he met Alexandra, she became convinced of his mystical powers, and he earned himself a seat of great importance within the royal court. You can almost think of Rasputin like Jafar from Aladdin. He was the evil advisor to the king and whispered decisions in his ear. But alas, Rasputin was seen as a dangerous menace by the other Russian elites. And on December 20th, 1916, Rasputin was shot to death by assassins. Number 9. Louis XIV. Louis XIV is a perfect example of what happens when a man is given absolute power and nobody ever tells him no. Louis is a well-known ruler. In fact, he's one of the best-remembered kings of Europe. He built the Palace of Versailles and created a lasting monarchy in France. But he lived during a time when people in Europe had some very weird beliefs, and he was just as strange. Louis XIV was born in 1638, and he became king at the young age of 5. Because of this, he grew up believing that he was essentially a god among men. He was so bizarre that male courtiers who sat at his dinner table had to do so by following 3 specific steps. They had to slide their left foot in front of their right foot, place their hands on the sides of their chair, and then gently lower themselves down. This absolutely had to be done, or the courtier was not allowed to sit with the king. He had other strange rules as well. For example, nobody was ever allowed to knock on his door. Instead, they had to lightly scratch the door with their pinky finger. Louis XIV was also a filthy man. In the 17th century, physicians believed that bathing opened up pores so that disease could pour into the human body. People were generally warned to avoid washing at all costs. Historical accounts claim Louis XIV only bathed 3 times in his whole life. Instead, he changed his linens 3 times a day to keep himself as clean as possible. Number 8. Anne Green. Anne Green was born in England sometime around the year 1628. By all accounts, she was a poor woman who worked as a scullery maid in the house of Sir Thomas Reed. Little is known about her early life, but we know a lot about Anne's death. After she was found guilty of infanticide in 1650, she was hanged. But shockingly, she survived her execution. It was such a miraculous occurrence that many believed she had supernatural powers. Anne Green was 22 years old when she worked as a maid for Thomas. She claimed that the man's grandson, who was only 16, seduced her and got her pregnant. However, she would later miscarry while sitting on the toilet, and she tried to conceal the remains. But she was found out, and Sir Thomas had her prosecuted under the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act, which was a very real act put in place in 1624. On behalf of the miscarried infant, Anne was sentenced to death for murder. On December 14th, she was hanged at Oxford Castle. But the hanging didn't go very well. Several of her friends pulled her body down so the rope could strangle her while a soldier hit her in the head with his musket. After 30 minutes of this brutality, she was cut down and handed over to physicians at the University of Oxford for dissection. The next day, the physicians opened her coffin and found Anne alive. They nursed her back to health, and after a month she was perfectly fine, except for a bit of amnesia. It was believed that she was saved by the hand of God and was forgiven for the murder charge. Number 7. Comte de Saint-Germain. Comte de Saint-Germain, or the Count of Saint-Germain, was an alchemist who allegedly discovered the secret for immortality. Historical records date his birth to the late 1600s, although rumor has it that he was born closer to the time of Christ. He supposedly appeared multiple times throughout history, even in the 1970s. Each time he crops up, he always looks like he's about 45 years old. He was known by many famous European figures, such as Voltaire, Catherine the Great, and King Louis XV. But this man is the source of much controversy and speculation. The official Saint-Germain, the man who definitely existed, first appeared in records in European high society in 1742. He was a mystical scientist who could supposedly control the elements. He spent 5 years in Persia studying the jeweler's craft, and he delighted kings and queens with his extensive knowledge of history. He could even speak at least a dozen languages. He was so extraordinary that he soon became friends with all the top nobles of Europe. Then in Paris in 1760, Countess von Georgy heard that a man named Comte de Saint-Germain had arrived at the home of one of King Louis XV's mistresses. The elderly countess was interested because she'd met someone by the same name in Venice in 1710. When she laid eyes upon him again, she was shocked to see that he hadn't aged in 50 years. We don't know what happened to Saint-Germain or if he really was immortal, and it's a mystery as to how he keeps appearing randomly throughout history. The only thing that's for certain is that he took Europe by storm in the 1700s with his exceptional wisdom and personality. Number 6. King Tutankhamun. King Tutankhamun is one of the most famous Egyptian pharaohs that we know about, and yet his time on the throne was short-lived. He became the king of Egypt in 1332 BC at the ripe young age of 9, and he ruled at a time when battles raged over much of the region. Then, less than a decade after he came into power, King Tut died at 18 years old. We knew almost nothing about him until British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered his treasure-filled tomb in 1922. A century later, we still don't know all of King Tut's secrets. For example, we aren't sure exactly how he was killed. Some say he was murdered, possibly by poison, but nobody is certain. Modern 3D scans have shown that the powerful king was in very poor health at the time of his death, and maybe even suffered from a broken leg. Some experts have guessed that he could have tumbled out of his chariot, then died from an infection caused by one of his wounds. If that were true, it would be the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a modern king dying in a car accident. Do you think King Tut really died after falling out of his chariot? Or do you think he could have been assassinated? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 5. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a mysterious yet mighty woman who lived in the Middle Ages and ruled 2 nations. She was a mother to kings, and she led one of the Crusades. She also played politics in France and England. No woman in medieval Europe stands out quite as much as Eleanor, who was once the most eligible bachelorette in the world. Eleanor was born sometime around 1124 in southwest France. After her brother died in 1130 and her father passed away in April of 1137, she was left as the heiress to her father's dominions in Aquitaine and beyond. She was married to the future Louis VII of France in 1137, and 7 days later she was named queen. She gave birth to 2 daughters, and then in 1147 she departed for the Holy Land to help fight the Second Crusade with her husband. However, this decision was an utter disaster, and Eleanor, feeling defeated, sailed back to France in 1149. Her marriage to Louis was declared void in 1152, and a couple of years later she married Henry II, making her the Queen of England. Over the course of their marriage, Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, 3 daughters and 5 sons. Eleanor continued to be a force of nature up into her 70s, something that was practically unheard of in the Middle Ages. One of her sons, Richard the Lionheart, grew up to be King of England, and in 1204 she passed away when she was around 80 years old. Number 4. Witch Elm Bella. 4 young boys in England went out into the forest to look for bird eggs at the height of the Second World War. They didn't find any eggs, but what they discovered instead was a human skull hidden in the hollow trunk of a wych elm. They alerted the authorities, who found the entire skeleton stuffed inside the hollow tree. The pathologist who did the investigation determined that the skeleton belonged to a woman who'd been dead for about 18 months. The police initially thought it would be an easy investigation. Abnormalities with the woman's jaw suggested they would be able to find her identity through dental records, but that didn't lead to anything. Then anthropologist Professor Margaret Murray came forward to say the woman bore all the signs of a black magic execution. Being buried inside of a tree is part of a belief that the victim will be unable to haunt whoever murdered them. Then things got even stranger when graffiti began to appear in different parts of England. The graffiti said, "Who put Bella down the witch elm?" To this day, the mystery has never been solved. Some have speculated the victim was a German spy, but those accusations have never been confirmed. The creepy graffiti continued all the way until 1999, and while modern DNA tests might be able to solve the mystery of who Bella was and why she was in the tree, the skeleton has since vanished without a trace. Number 3. Charles XII. Over 300 years ago in 1718, King Charles XII of Sweden was shot to death in a battle that took place in Norway. Ever since he passed away, people have wondered who killed him. We don't know if it was an enemy bullet that killed the king or if he was assassinated by a friend. However, a group of Finnish researchers recently claimed to have solved the mystery. The king was trying to take the Danish fortress of Fredrikstad when he died from a gunshot wound to the head. The researchers from Finland decided to finally solve the mystery by test-firing different kinds of ammunition and comparing the wounds to the gaping hole in Charles's mummified skull. According to their tests, they concluded that Charles was killed by an iron bullet. Based on a hole in his skull, the bullet was traveling at about 656 feet per second. This suggests that the bullet came from the enemy fortress, not from one of his own soldiers acting as a secret assassin. Number 2. The Magi. Apparently, Christmas doesn't end on December 25th. The truth is that in Christian traditions, there are 12 days of Christmas which culminate on January the 6th. This day is called the Feast of the Epiphany, the day the three wise men, also called the three wise kings or the three Magi, first beheld the newborn baby Jesus. But were the three wise men truly historical figures, or were they just made-up characters in an ancient story? The truth is that the three wise men only appear in chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew, and we don't even know if there were 3 of them. It simply says, "some men from the east," leaving the number of wise men up for interpretation. These men saw a star appear in the east, and somehow knew that a baby had just been born that would eventually grow up to be the king of the Jews. They followed the star to the location of Jesus and Mary, and they showered the holy baby with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Kristen Swenson from the Virginia Commonwealth University is an expert in religious studies. She says the Gospel of Matthew reimagines a much older prophecy written in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. This older prophecy says that one day nations will recognize Israel as the light of the world, and they'll shower the country with gifts. What gifts, you might ask? Gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We don't know who the three wise men were, but many religious scholars don't even think they were real to begin with. Number 1. King Henry IV. King Henry IV of France reigned from 1589 to 1610. He was raised Protestant thanks to his mother, at a time when most French people were Catholic and uninterested in being ruled by a Protestant. France had been fighting wars for the past few years between Catholics and Protestants, and everyone was ready for a single religion. But they didn't think that Henry was the answer. In 1598, Henry enraged the majority of the population by imposing a law that allowed people to be Protestant if they wanted to. It was surprisingly progressive because he was giving people the choice, whereas most policies in Europe forced people to be either one or the other. Henry was a hated man by most sides, and so it was no surprise when he was murdered by a Catholic extremist on the streets of Paris on May 14, 1610. But this wasn't the only attempt on his life. King Henry miraculously survived over 20 assassination attempts throughout his time on the throne. Although he was largely disliked during his rule, he took on the nickname Good King Henry after his death. He ended up becoming one of the most beloved kings in French history. On a side note, his head was stolen from his crypt in 1793, and then it was supposedly stashed in a bank vault somewhere in Paris. Which of these mysterious historical figures is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.